The desert air froze in Miguel Reyes' lungs as he stared down the barrels of a dozen AK-47s, their metal glinting like snake fangs in the merciless Sonoran sun. Time collapsed into a singular moment of terrible clarity. 20 years of driving. The Pan-American highway had taught him to recognize death when it blocked the road. And today death wore the unmistakable insignia of the Sinaloa cartel. His knuckles whitened against the worn leather of his steering wheel as sweat traced cold rivers down his spine. Behind him, 5 more trucks idled nervously, their drivers men who had entrusted their lives to Miguel's experience, waiting for a signal that would determine whether they'd return to their families or become another tragic statistic in drug war. Miguel's mind raced through his options, each one evaporating like morning dew under the heat of reality. Surrender meant certain death, or worse, being forced into service running drugs across borders until they no longer needed him. Fighting back with nothing but a rusty .38 revolver hidden beneath his seat seemed equally suicidal against a small army of cartel soldiers whose casual brutality had become legendary throughout Chihuahua and beyond. The convoy carried medical supplies destined for rural clinics, antibiotics, vaccines, surgical equipment, cargo valuable enough to commandeer but not worth dying for under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Miguel knew the cartel's reputation. They didn't just take what they wanted, they made examples. His gaze drifted to the small St. Christopher medallion hanging from his rearview mirror, a gift from his daughter on her 15th birthday. "To keep you safe on the road, Papa," she had said. 7 years later, he wondered if its protection had finally run out. The cartel lieutenant approached Miguel's window, tapping it with the barrel of his gold-plated pistol. "Baja," he commanded. "Get down." But as Miguel reached for the door handle, something caught his eye, a detail so insignificant it might have been overlooked by anyone else. In that moment, a plan began to form in his mind, audacious, desperate, and utterly unexpected. The kind of plan born only when a man has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. What happened in the next 72 hours would not only save the lives of his fellow drivers but send shockwaves through the cartel's territorial dominance, becoming whispered legend among truckers from Tijuana to The strategy Miguel Reyes employed that day would eventually be studied in law enforcement academies across Latin America as the moment when an ordinary man found an extraordinary weakness in the armor of Mexico's most feared criminal organization. 3 days earlier, Miguel Reyes had been a different man in a different world. The pre-dawn light painted the streets of Hermosillo in gentle blues and grays as Miguel kissed his sleeping wife Elena goodbye. After 23 years of marriage, he'd perfected the art of the silent departure, a necessity for a man whose workdays often began at 4 in the morning. He paused at the doorway of his daughter's room, Lucia's textbooks still scattered across her desk from her late-night study session. At 22, she was in her 4th year of medical school at the University of Sonora. Her determination to become a doctor in the underserved rural communities making Miguel's chest swell with pride each time he thought of it. Outside, the air carried the familiar scent of desert sand and early morning cooking fires from the neighbor's yard. Miguel's home wasn't grand, a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city, but it represented everything he'd built over decades of honest work. The mortgage was nearly paid off, Lucia's education secured 3 years of careful saving, and Elena's small restaurant, Sabres de Sonora, had finally begun turning a consistent profit after 5 years of struggle. Miguel slid into his Ford pickup, the engine grumbling to life with the familiar rattle he'd never bothered to fix. The truck was like him, weathered, reliable, and not yet ready for retirement, despite showing its age. The drive to the transport company's yard took 15 minutes, giving him time to mentally prepare for the 5-day journey ahead. Transports Médicos del Norte had been Miguel's employer for 18 years. The company specialized in delivering medical supplies to clinics throughout northern Mexico, a service that had become increasingly vital and dangerous as rural healthcare struggled amidst the country's ongoing cartel conflicts. As operations manager and lead driver, Miguel carried the dual responsibility of ensuring deliveries reached their destinations and bringing his team home safely. The company yard buzzed with early morning activity when Miguel arrived. Mechanics performed final checks on the 6-truck convoy, while loaders secured the last pallets of supplies. Miguel spotted his team gathered around a thermos of coffee near the dispatch office. "El Jefe has arrived," called out Carlos Fuentes, his oldest friend and longest-serving colleague. At 58, Carlos was just 2 years from retirement, a milestone he mentioned in nearly every conversation these days. His salt and pepper mustache twitched as he grinned. "Tell me, you brought some of Elena's conchis." Miguel produced a paper bag from his lunch cooler. "She'd never let me leave without extras for you vultures." The sweet bread disappeared quickly among the grateful drivers. Besides Carlos there were the twins, Ernesto and Eduardo Vargas, 30 former military transporters who drove in tandem and communicated in the cryptic shorthand of siblings. Pedro Ortiz, a serious ex-soldier who'd joined the company 3 years ago after leaving the Mexican army, stood slightly apart, checking his route maps with characteristic thoroughness. And finally, there was Javier Mendoza, at 26, the youngest of the group, a former mechanic whose understanding of engines was matched only by his eagerness to prove himself. "The usual route?" asked Pedro, his eyes not leaving the map. Miguel nodded. "Nogales first, then east through Agua Prieta, south to Nubo, Casas Grandes, and finishing in Chihuahua City. 5 days if everything goes smoothly." "When does everything ever go smoothly?" Eduardo said, exchanging a knowing glance with his twin. The military checkpoint at Emiris reported increased activity near the Sierra Madre, Miguel acknowledged. "But we've got clearance papers and we're sticking to main highways." "Cartel activity?" Pedro asked bluntly, finally looking up. Miguel hesitated. There was no point sugarcoating the reality they all lived with. Los Sinaloas and Los Zetas are fighting over smuggling routes again. "Nothing directly on our path, but we'll keep the usual precautions." The usual precautions had evolved over the years as Mexico's security situation deteriorated, driving only during daylight hours, maintaining regular radio contact, no stopping except at designated safe zones, and each driver carrying a legally registered sidearmer. Last resort, none of them had yet needed to use DOT as the team dispersed to their trucks. Alicia Vega, the dispatch manager, waved Miguel into her office. In her 50s, Alicia had the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much change too quickly in her country. "The director called this morning," she said without preamble. "The Chihuahua clinics are desperate for these antibiotics. There's an infection outbreak in 3 villages. Miguel nodded. "We'll get them there." "I know you will." She slid a folder across her desk. But the situation report came in. "Los Sinaloas have expanded their checkpoints. They're stopping commercial vehicles on Highway 15. Miguel took the folder, scanning the federal police bulletin. Inside, extorting transportation fees, at minimum. Alicia's expression darkened. 2 drivers from Transports Gonzalez disappeared last week after refusing to pay. Their trucks were found empty. The unspoken reality hung between them. The cartels had evolved from merely taxing shipments passing through their territory to commandeering entire vehicles and drivers for their own operations. A truck driver with legitimate paperwork made an ideal mule for crossing checkpoints with hidden contraband. "We could reschedule," Alicia suggested. "Take the coastal route next week." Miguel calculated quickly. The coastal route would add 3 days. 3 days the clinics couldn't afford to wait for critical supplies. 3 more days of people suffering, possibly dying. "We'll stick to the plan," he decided. "But we'll add extra precautions. Radio check-ins every 30 minutes instead of hourly. And we'll buddy system no truck drives more than a kilometer from another." Alicia didn't look relieved, but she nodded. "The company will back whatever decision you make, you know that." Back in the yard, Miguel gathered his team for a final briefing, outlining the additional security measures without causing undue alarm. These men trusted him with their lives regularly. He wouldn't betray that trust by either downplaying risks or inducing panic. As the convoy pulled out of the yard, Miguel in the lead truck, he adjusted his rearview mirror, catching sight of the St. Christopher medallion Lucia had given him. The patron saint of travelers swung gently with the truck's movement. "Keep us safe," he murmured, not considering himself a particularly religious man, but finding comfort in the ritual nonetheless. The first day's drive proceeded without incident. The convoy moved steadily north toward the U.S. border town of Nogales, where they would deliver the first shipment of supplies to a community health center serving migrant populations. The familiar rhythm of the road settled over Miguel, the hypnotic white lines of the highway, the predictable chatter on the CB radio, the silent companionship of his thermos of coffee. They spent the night at a secure trucking compound in Nogales. one of the increasingly rare safe havens for commercial drivers. Over dinner in the compound's canteen, conversation drifted to lighter topics: Carlos's plans for his approaching retirement, Javier's recent engagement, the twins' ongoing debate about expanding their family's auto repair shop. For a few hours, they were just ordinary men with ordinary concerns. The shadow of cartel violence temporarily held at bay by fluorescent lights, and the comfort of routine. Morning brought the first deviation from the familiar. As Miguel supervised the unloading at the Nogales clinic, his phone buzzed with a text from a fellow driver, an old friend now running routes for a competing company. Avoid Highway 15 after Santa Ana. Federales have pulled back. Eagles hunting on the road. Miguel's jaw tightened. Eagles was trucker code for cartel lookouts. The message confirmed his fears. Los Sinaloas weren't just establishing random checkpoints, they were strategically filling vacuums left by retreating federal forces. When the team reassembled, Miguel shared the warning: "We have two options. We detour north, cross at Douglas instead of Agua Prieta, adding about 4 hours, or we continue as planned and increase vigilance. The supplies for Agua Prieta can't wait," Pedro reminded them. "That's the tuberculosis medication." "For hours might not seem like much," added Carlos, "but for someone waiting on medicine. The decision settled over them like a physical weight. They would continue as planned, eyes open, aware that each kilometer brought them closer to territory where the normal rules of civilization had frayed to breaking point. As they left Nogales behind, heading east, toward Agua Prieta, the landscape changed dramatically. The relatively developed areas near the border gave way to the stark beauty of the Sonoran desert: mesquite trees and saguaro, cacti standing sentinel over sun-baked earth. Miguel had always found peace in these stretches of emptiness, but today the vast open spaces felt exposed, vulnerable. The convoy maintained strict formation, radios crackling with check-ins every 30 minutes. Around midday, they approached the small town of Escueda, normally a brief rest stop on their route. But as they neared the town limits, Miguel noticed something that sent a chill through him despite the desert heat. The gas station where they usually stopped was deserted, its windows dark despite the open sign. All trucks passed through Escueda without stopping. He ordered into the radio, "Maintain speed, maintain distance." "What are you seeing, boss?" Carlos's voice crackled back. "What I'm not seeing," Miguel replied. "No locals, no traffic. In the desert communities, life happened outdoors, people walking, talking, doing business in the street." Empty streets in the middle of a business day meant only one thing: the locals knew something the convoy didn't. As they passed through the unnaturally quiet town, Miguel caught a glimpse of movement in his side mirror, a black SUV pulling out from a side street, falling into position behind the last truck in the convoy. "Eduardo, Ernesto, we have a tail," Miguel said calmly into the radio. "Black Suburban, no plates, 3 occupants that I can see." "Confirmed," came Eduardo's terse reply. "They're keeping distance for now. Everyone maintains speed. No indications we've noticed them." Miguel's mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. For 20 tense minutes, the convoy continued eastward, the SUV maintaining a consistent half-kilometer distance behind them. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vehicle turned off onto a dirt road heading south. "They're breaking off," Ernesto reported. "Looks like they're just calling in our position." Miguel's hands relaxed slightly on the wheel, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. If the cartel was tracking their movement, it meant they were being herded, not merely followed. By late afternoon, as the convoy approached Agua Prieta, a border town known for both its legitimate commerce and its strategic importance to drug trafficking routes, Miguel made a decision. He directed the convoy to the municipal hospital, larger, more secure facility than the clinic that had been their original destination. "We'll deliver everything here," he told the team as they began unloading. "The hospital can distribute to the outlying clinics." The hospital administrator didn't question the change in plans, another sign of how routine such security adaptations had become, as vaccines, antibiotics, and equipment were transferred from trucks to the hospital storage. Miguel stepped aside to call Alicia back at dispatch. "We're diverting," he explained. "After we finish here, we're taking the northern route through Genoes, instead of going directly to Nuevo Casas Grandes. That's almost 100 kilometers out of your way," Alicia noted, concern evident in her voice. "We're being watched, possibly tracked." I want to change the pattern, see if we can shake them before heading south. Miguel paused. How critical is the timeline for the Chihuahua deliveries? The situation in the villages is getting worse. They reported 15 new cases yesterday. Alicia's voice dropped. But the cargo isn't worth your lives, Miguel. We'll get it there, he assured her. The same promise he always made. Just might take an extra day. As Miguel ended the call, he looked across the hospital parking lot where his team efficiently worked, their movements betraying no sign of the tension each man surely felt. These were good men, men with families, dreams, futures, men who had placed their trust in his judgment. The weight of responsibility settled across Miguel's shoulders like a familiar yoke. He would get these men and their life-saving cargo safely to their destination. He had always found a way before, but as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the usual ways might not be enough. Night fell over Agua Prieta like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the eerie quiet that had descended on border towns as the cartel wars intensified. The convoy had secured rooms at Motel Frontera, a modest establishment that catered to truckers, and had the advantage of a walled parking compound, where the vehicles could be monitored overnight. Miguel sat alone at a small plastic table outside his room, nursing a cup of instant coffee that had long since gone cold. The rest of his team had retreated to their rooms after a tense dinner where conversation felt forced and laughter was noticeably absent. Only the occasional ping of Miguel's phone broke the silence. Updates from other drivers on the road, each message adding another piece to the increasingly troubling puzzle of cartel movements throughout the region. Can't sleep either. Carlos appeared in the dim light, pulling up a chair beside Miguel. Without waiting for an invitation, he produced a flask from his jacket pocket and added a generous pour to Miguel's cold coffee. Someone has to worry, Miguel replied, nodding thanks for the improvement to his drink. And you've always been the best at it. Carlos took a sip from the flask. The detour through Llanos, you really think that will make a difference? Miguel considered the question carefully. Probably not. But it changes the equation, forces them to adjust if they're planning something. Carlos raised an eyebrow. When Miguel conceded, they sat in companionable silence for a moment. Two men who had driven enough miles together to know when words were unnecessary. I've been thinking, Carlos finally said, his voice dropping lower. This is my last run. Miguel turned to study his friend's face in the dim light. You've still got 2 months before retirement. Elena's sister in Guadalajara says they've got a place for us. Away from all this. Carlos gestured vaguely at the darkness beyond the motel walls. I was going to finish out the schedule, but Mariana is scared. Every time I leave, she thinks. He didn't need to finish the thought. Miguel nodded slowly. They both knew too many drivers who hadn't made it to retirement. We'll miss you. You should think about it too, amigo. How many more years of this? For what? So the cartels can take more territory while the government pretends to fight them. Bitterness edged into Carlos's voice. 20 years ago, we'd never have worried about making a simple delivery run. 20 years ago, the rural clinics had even less support than they do now, Miguel reminded him. The people who need these supplies, they don't get to leave. Always. The idealist. Carlos shook his head, but there was fondness in the gesture. Just promise me you won't take stupid risks for a cargo of medicine. No delivery is worth your life. Before Miguel could respond, a notification lit up his phone screen. He opened the message, then immediately stood, tension radiating from his body. What is it? Carlos asked. Instantly alert. Military checkpoint has been withdrawn from Highway 2, Miguel said, showing Carlos the message from a driver who had just passed through Llanos, as of 2 hours ago. No warning, no replacement. That's our entire route tomorrow. Exactly. And not just any section, the most isolated stretch. Miguel was already dialing Alicia, despite the late hour. When she answered, the background noise suggested she was still at the dispatch office. The military pulled out of Llanos, he said without preamble. I was about to call you, Alicia replied, her voice tight. It's not just Llanos. Federal forces have been redeployed from 3 key checkpoints along your route. Official explanation is strategic realignment of resources. In other words, someone was paid off. Miguel translated grimly. The company is recommending you delay in Agua Prieta until we can arrange military escort. 3 days minimum. Miguel calculated quickly. 3 more days meant the medicine would arrive nearly a week later than originally planned. For patients waiting on tuberculosis medication and antibiotics, that could be the difference between recovery and death. The alternate southern route through Madeira, he suggested, closed due to flash flooding as of this afternoon. Alicia's frustration was evident. It's like all the safe options are disappearing at once. After ending the call, Miguel explained the situation to Carlos, whose expression grew increasingly grave. It's not random, Carlos concluded. They're isolating the route deliberately. Question is, why target us? Medical supplies aren't high-value cargo for cartels, unless Miguel's blood ran cold as the pieces suddenly aligned. Unless they don't want the cargo, they want the trucks. Carlos grasped the implication immediately. Clean vehicles with legitimate paperwork and experienced drivers who know the border crossings, perfect for moving product north. Miguel finished the thought. The two men stared at each other, the full weight of their situation settling between them. This wasn't going to be a simple case of paying a toll to pass through cartel territory. Los Sinaloas were creating a vacuum specifically to capture their convoy and likely the drivers along with it. We need to tell the others, Carlos said. Miguel nodded, already moving to wake the team. Within 15 minutes, all 6 drivers had gathered in Miguel's room, faces grim as he outlined their situation. So we're trapped, Javier said, the youngest driver looking considerably older in that moment. Stay here and wait for an escort. That might never come. Or drive into an ambush. There's a third option, Miguel said quietly. We split up the cargo, take different routes, smaller vehicles, less obvious targets. Pedro shook his head immediately. Divide our strength. That's exactly what they'd want. They could pick us off one by one. What about abandoning the cargo? Eduardo suggested. We notify the company, let insurance handle it, and get ourselves to safety. A heavy silence fell over the room. Abandoning a delivery was the last resort in their profession, an admission of defeat that went against everything they stood for as drivers. The people waiting for these medicines don't have time for insurance claims and replacement shipments, Miguel finally said. Some of them may not survive the delay. No one argued the point. They had all seen the desperate conditions in the rural clinics they served, at the overworked doctors, the insufficient equipment, the patients who had traveled days to receive treatment. So what do we do? Ernesto asked the question they were all thinking. Miguel moved to the small table where he had spread out their route maps. We adapt, change our profile, change our timing, change everything they might be expecting. His finger traced a line across the map that followed no major highway. We go off-grid. Pedro leaned in, studying the route Miguel indicated. The old mining roads. They're barely maintained. Some might not even be passable for our trucks, which makes them the last place the cartel would expect us to go, Miguel countered. They're setting a trap on the main highways, so we avoid the highways entirely. The room erupted in overlapping voices, concerns about the rough terrain, the lack of support if they broke down, the additional time it would add to their journey. Miguel let them talk, understanding their need to process the danger they faced. When the voices finally quieted, Miguel looked at each man in turn. I won't force anyone to take this risk. Anyone who wants to stay behind, the company will understand. No one moved. Then we leave before dawn, Miguel decided, and we make one more change. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out 6 prepaid mobile phones, still in their packaging. New communications. Our regular phones stay here, batteries removed. As his team dispersed to prepare for the early departure, Miguel stepped outside again, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the motel's security lights. Somewhere out there, men were preparing to intercept his convoymen, who wouldn't hesitate to kill or kidnap to get what they wanted. For the first time in his career, Miguel was about to drive not just around a threat, but directly against it. The familiar weight of the St. Christopher medallion seemed heavier against his chest as he silently prayed that his plan wouldn't lead these men, his friends, to their deaths. The convoy slipped out of Agua Prieta under cover of darkness, headlights dimmed to the minimum safe level as they moved in tight formation through the sleeping town. Miguel led in his truck, eyes constantly scanning for signs of surveillance. The usual pre-dawn traffic of delivery vehicles and early shift workers was notably absent, an other warning sign that something had fundamentally changed in the familiar rhythms of the border community. Rather than taking the expected turn onto Highway 2, Miguel guided the convoy down a series of progressively smaller roads until they reached an unmarked dirt track that wound into the foothills of the Sierra Madre. According to his maps, these roads had once connected a network of small silver mines, most abandoned decades ago when the ore played out. They remained passable, if barely, maintained occasionally by local ranchers and the few remaining mining operations. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Miguel pulled to a stop at a vantage point overlooking the valley they had just navigated. One by one, the other trucks joined him, engines idling as the drivers stepped out to confer. "First phase complete," Miguel said, handing out bottles of water from his cooler. "No signs of pursuit yet," Pedro added, his military training evident in the way he surveyed their surroundings, identifying defensive positions and potential vulnerabilities automatically. "We should keep moving," Javier urged, the youngest driver visibly tense. "The longer we stay in one place, double quotes." Miguel nodded agreement. "We'll stop only when necessary from now on. 10 minutes every 2 hours to check the vehicles and stretch. No longer." "What's our fuel situation?" asked Carlos, always the pragmatist. "All trucks topped off before leaving Agua Prieta, range of approximately 900 kilometers, Miguel confirmed. "The entire detour is roughly 400 kilometers. We should reach Chihuahua with reserve fuel, assuming the roads remain passable," Ernesto pointed out. "That's why we have this." Miguel reached into his truck and pulled out a piece of equipment. That brought a murmur of appreciation from the group, a heavy-duty winch system that could be temporarily mounted on any of their trucks. Borrowed from the maintenance bay before we left Hermosillo, the sight of the equipment seemed to reassure the team. It represented not just practical preparation for the difficult terrain ahead, but Miguel's foresight in anticipating their needs. "One more thing," Miguel continued, his tone becoming more serious. "From now on, we maintain radio silence, except for emergencies. We communicate through the burner phones when necessary, using the code system." The code system was an old trucker's method that predated digital communications, a series of simple numerical sequences that represented common phrases and situations. Originally developed to navigate around old CB radio restrictions, the system had evolved into a kind of private language among experienced drivers. The beauty of it was its apparent simplicity. Even if intercepted, the messages would appear to be random numbers to anyone not familiar with the specific variation the team used. "First scheduled check-in is at 0900, Miguel concluded. "If anyone misses a check-in, we assume they're in trouble and implement the contingency plan." With that, the drivers returned to their vehicles, the brief conference having taken less than 5 minutes. As Miguel climbed back into his cab, he allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had successfully broken pattern, potentially disrupting whatever trap had been laid for them on the main highways. Now they just needed to navigate some of the most challenging terrain in northern Mexico without attracting attention. The optimism proved short. Less than an hour into their journey along the mining roads, the convoy encountered the first significant obstacle, a section of road washed out by recent rains, creating a gully nearly 2 meters wide cutting directly across their path. "Hold positions," Miguel instructed over his burner phone as he and Pedro surveyed the damage. "We can't go around," Pedro observed, noting the steep embankments on either side, "and turning back means at least 3 hours lost." Miguel studied the gully, calculating angles and load-bearing capacity with the experienced eye of a man who had spent his life managing the limitations and capabilities of heavy vehicles. "We build a crossing," he decided. "There's enough debris to create a base. We reinforce with the steel plates from Truck 3. The steel plates were part of the medical equipment they transported, flat, reinforced loading ramps for wheeling heavy hospital beds and machinery, not designed for supporting 18-wheeler trucks, but potentially strong enough, if properly supported, for the next 2 hours. The team worked in grim silence, moving rocks and fallen trees to create a makeshift foundation across the gully, then carefully positioning the steel plates to create a narrow but potentially viable bridge. Pedro, with his military engineering experience, directed the final positioning, testing each step of the construction before declaring it ready. "One truck at a time, minimum distance between vehicles," Miguel instructed. "I'll go first." He eased his truck forward, feeling the makeshift bridge flex alarmingly beneath the weight. The other drivers watched, breath held collectively, as Miguel's front wheels reached the far side. Then the rear wheels followed, and a muted cheer went up from the team. One by one, the remaining trucks crossed, each passage further stressing the improvised structure. Javier's truck, the last to cross, nearly didn't make it as one of the steel plates shifted precariously beneath his rear axle. But with careful guidance from Pedro and Eduardo walking alongside, the young driver managed to clear the obstacle. "We should collapse the bridge behind us," Pedro suggested as they prepared to move on. "If anyone's following, this would be a clear sign of our passing." Miguel considered the advice, then nodded agreement. Using a chain attached to Ernesto's truck, they pulled the steel plates free, watching as they clattered down into the gully. Along with much of their stone foundation, by mid-morning, the convoy had encountered and overcome 3 similar obstacles: another washout, a fallen tree blocking their path, and a section of road so deeply rutted that each truck had to be carefully guided through one at a time. Each delay cost them precious time, but Miguel maintained a steady focus on their progress rather than their setbacks. During their second brief rest stop, as the drivers checked their vehicles for damage from the punishing terrain, Miguel's burner phone vibrated with a message from Alicia at dispatch. "Federals conducted sweep of Motel Frontera after your departure, searching for Convoy, cartel informants within police." The message confirmed what Miguel had already suspected: the cartel had infiltrated local law enforcement, turning what should have been protection into another threat. He shared the information with his team, watching as it hardened their resolve rather than weakening it. They were committed now, with no safe way back. As they approached the halfway point of their detour, the terrain gradually shifted from the rocky foothills to a vast plateau of scrub desert. The change brought both advantages and new concerns. The flatter ground allowed them to increase their speed slightly, but the open terrain made the convoy more visible from a distance. "Air surveillance possible here," Pedro noted during their next check-in. "Cartel has been using light aircraft and drones for reconnaissance." Miguel had considered this vulnerability. "We split formation," he decided. 2 kilometers between each truck, different routes where possible, converging at the next waypoint. The strategy was risky. It meant abandoning the security of their tight convoy, but it significantly reduced their profile as a group. A single truck on a back road might be a local rancher or minor mining operation. 6 trucks in formation would immediately signal something unusual. That as Miguel prepared to implement this next phase of their evasion, a crackling transmission came through the emergency channel of their CB radio, the one system they had kept operational for last resort communications. "Atención Convoy Médico. This is Capitan Ramirez, Federal Police. We have your position. Maintain current course and prepare to be intercepted for your safety. Acknowledged." Miguel exchanged glances with Carlos, who had pulled alongside during the rest stop. Neither man reached for the radio. "Federal Police don't announce intercepts on open channels," Pedro said quietly, confirming what they all suspected. "And they don't know our current position unless they have a tracker on one of the trucks." The implications sent a ripple of tension through the group. If they were being tracked, their entire detour strategy was compromised. "Check your vehicles," Miguel ordered. "Every inch. Look for anything that doesn't belong." For the next 30 minutes, the drivers conducted meticulous inspections of their trucks, focusing particularly on areas where a tracking device might be concealed: wheel wells, undercarriages, engine compartments, and cargo areas. It was Eduardo who finally discovered it: a small magnetic device professionally attached to the fuel tank of his truck. "Military grade," Pedro assessed, examining the device without removing it. "Not something you buy on the street. Can we disable it?" Miguel asked. Pedro shook his head. "Not without triggering an alert. It has tamper protection." Miguel considered their options, each seemingly worse than the last. Removing the tracker would immediately signal their awareness to whoever was monitoring. Leaving it in place meant continued surveillance. Abandoning Eduardo's truck would mean consolidating cargo, reducing their capacity, and potentially leaving critical supplies behind. Then an alternative occurred to him, a fourth option that might buy them the advantage of surprise. "We don't remove it," Miguel said slowly. "We move it." Understanding dawned on the faces around him. If they transferred the tracker to another vehicle, one not part of their convoy, they could send their pursuers in the wrong direction while continuing their journey. UNMONITORED. The opportunity presented itself less than an hour later, when they spotted a commercial logging truck heading north on a road that intersected their route. with Pedro and Ernesto creating a diversion pretending to be local mechanics. Assisting with an engine problem, Miguel managed to transfer the tracking device to the logging truck's undercarriage, completely unnoticed by its driver. That buys us time, but they'll realize the deception eventually, Miguel acknowledged as they regrouped. We need to increase our pace. The convoy pushed forward with renewed urgency, abandoning their previous caution in favor of speed. The rough terrain punished their vehicle's tires fought for traction on loose gravel. Suspensions groaned under the strain of unexpected dips and rises. Engine temperatures climbed as cooling systems struggled with the combination of heat and dust. By late afternoon, they had covered nearly 2/3 of their detour route, the most challenging sections now behind them. But the physical toll on both vehicles and drivers was becoming evident. During their fourth rest stop, Miguel noticed Carlos massaging his lower back, face tight with pain. Old injury acting up, Miguel asked, concern for his friend temporarily overriding the larger worries. Carlos attempted a dismissive shrug that failed to mask his discomfort. Nothing compared to what happens if we don't make this delivery. Miguel didn't press the issue, respecting his friend's pride, but he made a mental note to watch Carlos more closely. The oldest driver in their group, Carlos had been managing chronic back pain for years, the result of a previous accident and decades of sitting behind the wheel. Under normal circumstances, he handled it with medication and regular stretches, but these were far from normal circumstances, and stress had a way of amplifying old injuries. As they prepared to resume their journey, Miguel's burner phone vibrated with another message from Alicia. Military reporting increased cartel movement near Janos, multiple vehicles, armed personnel, setting up position on Highway 2. They're still expecting us on the main road. Miguel translated for the team. A small victory in their ongoing game of cat and mouse. The tracker deception is holding. For now, Pedro qualified, but we still have at least 4 hours of driving ahead of us, and they'll have spotters watching all approaches to Chihuahua. He was right. The final phase of their journey would be the most dangerous, the transition from backcountry to urban areas, where hiding 6 large trucks would become increasingly difficult. We don't approach Chihuahua until after dark, Miguel decided. And we don't enter as a convoy. Individual approaches different directions, staggered timing. The plan required precise coordination and perfect execution. Each driver would need to navigate independently through potentially hostile territory, timing their arrival at the Chihuahua hospital to avoid creating a pattern that might alert cartel observers. As the convoy moved out again, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, Miguel found himself mentally mapping contingencies within contingencies. What if one truck was spotted? What if the hospital itself was under surveillance? What if the cartel had more resources, more information, more determination than he had accounted for? These questions still occupied his mind 3 hours later, when the convoy reached their final waypoint before splitting up, an abandoned mining operation in the hills overlooking Chihuahua City. From this vantage point, they could see the sprawl of the city below, lights beginning to twinkle on as dusk deepened into evening. We'll wait 1 hour, Miguel instructed as the drivers gathered for their final briefing. Javier goes first, then Eduardo, Ernesto, Pedro, Carlos, and I'll be last. 20-minute intervals between departures. Different routes into the city as planned. Radio silence maintained until you've reached the hospital and secured your vehicle. The men nodded, understanding, faces solemn in the fading light. They had overcome significant obstacles together, but the most critical phase of their journey still lay ahead, the final approach, where each would be alone with their cargo and their courage. If you encounter a checkpoint or any situation that feels wrong, abort immediately, Miguel continued. The rendezvous point, if separated, is the Capilla de Guadalupe on the east side of the city. It's open all night for prayers, and the priest there is trustworthy. As the others moved away to make their final preparations, Carlos lingered, his expression troubled. You're taking the highest risk by going last, he said quietly. Miguel shrugged. If there's trouble, I'd rather know it's ahead of me than behind you. Always the protector. Carlos clasped Miguel's shoulder, the gesture conveying what words could not. Then, more seriously, what if we're overthinking this? What if it's just increased security because of the cartel activity, not specifically targeted at us? The question had occurred to Miguel as well. Were they running from shadows? Had the entire detour been an overreaction? Maybe, he conceded. but I'd rather explain to the company why we were overcautious than have to explain to your wife why you're not coming home." Carlos nodded slowly, unable to argue with that logic. With a final meaningful look, he moved away to prepare his truck for the final phase of their journey. Alone for a moment, Miguel climbed to the highest point of the abandoned mine structures, using a pair of compact binoculars to study the city below. Chihuahua sprawled across the valley, a mixture of ancient and modern colonial-era buildings alongside new development. Narrow streets opening into wide boulevards, residential neighborhoods blending into industrial zones. Somewhere in that urban maze, their destination awaited the central hospital, where doctors were counting on their delivery to treat patients, fighting infections that would not wait for safer times or clearer roads. And somewhere, perhaps, men with guns and bad intentions were watching, waiting, preparing to intercept a convoy that had unexpectedly vanished from their carefully monitored routes. That as darkness fell completely, Javier's truck, the first to depart, moved slowly down the hillside track, lights kept low until he reached the outskirts of the city. Miguel watched until the taillights disappeared among the grid of city streets below, then turned his attention to preparing the next departure. Eduardo's truck 20 minutes later. One by one, the trucks descended from their mountain refuge, each taking a different path toward their common destination. With each successful departure, Miguel felt a mixture of relief and increasing tension. 4 trucks safely away, then 5, until finally, only Miguel remained at the abandoned mine, his truck idling as he prepared for his own descent into the uncertain welcome of Chihuahua City. The night had grown cool, the desert's extreme temperature fluctuations bringing a chill that penetrated Miguel's jacket as he made one final sweep of the area, ensuring they had left no evidence of their presence. Satisfied, he climbed into his cab, adjusted his mirrors, and took a deep breath. "Just another delivery," he murmured to himself, touching the St. Christopher medallion briefly before putting his truck in gear. The steep, winding path down from the mine required his full concentration, leaving no room for the doubts and questions that had plagued him throughout the day. This singular focused emerging of man and machine against the challenges of the road had always been Miguel's refuge. In moments like these, the world narrowed to what was directly ahead, directly relevant, directly within his control. He was halfway down the mountain when his burner phone vibrated with a message that shattered that careful focus. The text, from Pedro, contained just 2 numbers from their code system. 9-1. Ambush ahead. Miguel braked immediately, bringing his truck to a silent stop on the darkened mountain road. His heart hammered against his ribs as he processed Pedro's warning. 9-1. Ambush ahead. The code that no driver ever wanted to receive. He switched off his headlights and engine, allowing the night to envelop him completely. In the sudden stillness, his senses heightened, the distant sound of city traffic below, the faint scent of dust and creosote bush carried on the desert breeze, the barely discernible glow of lights where the mountain road met the outskirts of Chihuahua. Miguel sent a single response, 8-4 details. The reply came seconds later. Police checkpoint at city entrance, not regular federals, armed men, searching all commercial vehicles. Javier and Eduardo cleared before setup. Ernesto stopped. No contact since. Miguel's blood ran cold. Ernesto, one of the twins, was potentially in cartel hands, and if they searched his truck thoroughly, they would find the shipping manifests with details of the entire convoy, including the hospital destination. 4-7. Miguel texted, status, location, others. Carlos diverted to alternate location. Pedro, at rendezvous point. Eduardo waiting for brother Javier, delivered cargo. Hiding at hospital. 5 trucks accounted for. 1 driver missing. Miguel stared at the city lights below, mind racing through scenarios and options, each more desperate than the last. Standard procedure would be to prioritize the remaining cargo and drivers, cut losses, complete the primary mission, report the situation to authorities. The company would understand. The insurance would cover the lost truck. Ernesto's family would receive compensation. But Miguel knew the reality behind such clinical calculations. If Ernesto had been taken by the cartel, there would be no body to recover, no closure for his family, just another name on the ever-growing list of Mexico's disappeared. And if they had identified the convoy's purpose and destination, the entire team remained at risk. A new message from Pedro interrupted his thoughts. multiple vehicles moving on mountain roads, searching patterns. Estimate 15 minutes until they reach your position. The walls were closing in. Miguel needed to make a decision, not just for himself, but for the men who had trusted him with their lives. He could continue his evasion, deliver his cargo, and join the others at the rendezvous point. The practical choice, the safe choice. Or he could do something else entirely. Miguel's fingers hovered over the phone, then typed quickly, "Hold positions. Maintain delivery protocol for remaining cargo. I'm implementing contingency red." Pedro's response was immediate. "Negative. Too dangerous. We come together." Miguel's reply was firm. "Denied. Complete the mission. That's an order." He switched off the phone before further arguments could come through. Contingency red wasn't an official company protocol. It was something Miguel had developed privately, but never expected to use a high-risk countermeasure for the worst-case scenario, where team members were captured and the convoy's security was fatally compromised. Working quickly in the darkness, Miguel accessed a hidden compartment beneath his truck's sleeper berth, removing several items that reflected preparation far beyond normal trucking precautions. A handheld GPS unit preloaded with regional maps, a compact set of tools, a small medical kit, and a satellite phone different from their standard communications equipment. Finally, he retrieved a sealed waterproof pouch containing identification documents not his own. Miguel changed quickly into clothes, unlike his usual driving attire, darker, more nondescript, suitable for moving without attracting attention. He transferred only essential items to a small backpack, leaving behind anything that might identify him or his company. From the cab of his truck, he removed the SD card from the vehicle's logging system, the electronic record of everywhere the truck had been. He then accessed the engine control module and initiated a sequence that would, in 30 minutes, erase all electronic identify information from the truck's systems. Miguel took one last look round the cab that had been his second home for so many years. His gaze fell on the St. Christopher medallion hanging from the rear-view mirror. After a moment's hesitation, he unhooked it and placed it around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt. Before exiting, he sent one final message to Alicia at dispatch, using the satellite phone. Convoy compromised. One driver missing. Implementing Protocol 19. No contact for 48 hours. Protocol 19 was an actual company emergency procedure, one that authorized the operations manager to take extraordinary measures to protect drivers and cargo in extreme situations. It was rarely invoked and would immediately trigger crisis responses at the corporate level. Miguel slipped out of the truck and into the darkness of the surrounding landscape. Rather than continuing down the road toward the city, he began moving laterally across the mountainside, using natural features for cover. His destination wasn't the hospital or the rendezvous point. He was heading directly toward the checkpoint where Ernesto had disappeared. Years of exploring the back roads and wilderness areas around his routes had given Miguel an intimate knowledge of the terrain that no GPS could match. Like veins in a living body, he knew how the smaller roads and trails interconnected, where they emerged, where they terminated. This knowledge had always been a professional asset. Tonight, it might be the only advantage he had against an enemy with superior numbers and firepower. As he navigated the difficult terrain in darkness, Miguel's mind returned to Ernesto. The younger twin was quieter than his brother, more thoughtful, with a passion for photography that he indulged at every opportunity. He had a fiancée waiting in Hermosillo and plans for a December wedding. Behind the wheel, he was methodical and precise, the kind of driver who maintained detailed logs and could recite fuel efficiency statistics from memory. Miguel refused to accept that Ernesto's future had been extinguished at a cartel checkpoint, not while he still had the capacity to act. After nearly an hour of careful movement through the scrub-covered hillsides, Miguel reached a position overlooking the checkpoint Pedro had described. Lying prone behind a rock outcropping, he used compact binoculars to assess the situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The checkpoint was no official operation. For vehicles, 2 SUVs with police markings and 2 unmarked pickup trucks were positioned to control access to the main road leading into Chihuahua from the north. Men with military-grade weapons stood guard, stopping all commercial vehicles while allowing passenger cars to pass with minimal inspection. And there, off to one side, was Ernesto's truck, its cargo doors standing open, contents partially unloaded. Of Ernesto himself, there was no sign. As Miguel watched, a black luxury SUV with tinted windows arrived at the checkpoint. A man emerged from the back seat, not dressed in tactical gear like the others, but in expensive casual clothes that nonetheless marked him as someone of authority. Even from a distance, Miguel could see the deference with which the armed men treated this new arrival. The well-dressed man inspected the contents of Ernesto's truck, then engaged in conversation with what appeared to be the leader of the checkpoint operation. Though too far away to hear their words, Miguel could read the body language, the gestures toward the mountain roads, the pointing in different directions. They were organizing search parties. The arrival of this apparent cartel lieutenant changed everything. This was no longer a simple hijacking. The presence of someone at that level of authority suggested a coordinated operation with specific objectives. They weren't just looking for random cargo to steal, they were hunting Miguel's convoy in particular. But why? What made 6 trucks of medical supplies worth this level of effort from an organization that trafficked in billions of dollars of drugs? As Miguel continued his observation, a vehicle pulled away from the checkpoint, heading south toward the city center. One of the unmarked pickup trucks, now with an escort of motorcycles. Something about the way it was handled, with guards positioned close around it, suggested it might be transporting something or someone valuable. Ernesto. Miguel made his decision instantly. Abandoning his observation post, he began making his way down toward the city, paralleling the route the pickup truck had taken. He needed transportation, information, and a way to communicate with his team without compromising their safety further. As he moved, the reality of what he was attempting crashed over him in waves. He was one man with minimal resources going against a cartel organization with hundreds of members, unlimited funds, and a territorial control that rivaled the government's. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was suicide, that the best he could hope for was to escape with his own life, much less rescue Ernesto or protect the rest of his team. But deeper than rationality, deeper than fear, Miguel felt something heartening within him, a core of determination that had always been there but never fully tested. These cartel men had miscalculated when they targeted his convoy. They saw trucks and cargo, drivers and routes. They didn't see the bonds formed over thousands of shared miles. The responsibility Miguel felt for each man who followed his lead. The promise implied every time he said, "We'll get there safely." As the lights of Chihuahua grew closer, Miguel reached into his pocket and felt the unfamiliar edges of the identification documents he had retrieved from his truck. Papers establishing him as Jorge Mendez, a freelance mechanic from Sonora. An identity he had created years ago but never expected to use. Part of a contingency plan for a day he hoped would never come. Miguel Reyes, the respected convoy leader and company man, couldn't move freely in a city where cartels were hunting for him. But Jorge Mendez could. Jorge Mendez could go places, ask questions, make connections that Miguel Reyes never could. For the first time in his life, Miguel was stepping completely outside the boundaries of law and procedure that had defined his career. There would be no company backup, no official support, no clear protocols to follow, just his wits, his determination, and whatever resources he could cobble together against an enemy that controlled the very ground he walked on. The medallion felt warm against his skin as Miguel reached the outskirts of Chihuahua, disappearing into the anonymity of the urban landscape. He had just crossed a line from which there was no return, from evasion to confrontation, from defense to offense. The cartel had started this game thinking the convoy was their prey. They were about to discover their mistake. Chihuahua City pulsed with nocturnal energy as Miguel, now moving through the world as Jorge Mendez melted into its crowded streets. The capital of Mexico's largest state was a study in contrasts. Colonial architecture alongside modern developments, extreme wealth neighboring desperate poverty, legitimate commerce intertwined with cartel influence. Under normal circumstances, Miguel only passed through the city, delivering cargo before moving on. Tonight, he navigated its depths with the desperate focus of a man on borrowed time. His first priority was transportation. Moving on foot left him vulnerable and limited his ability to track the vehicle that had taken Ernesto. 2 blocks from the city's main bus terminal, Miguel found what he was looking for: a small rental agency for motorcycles that catered to tourists and local couriers. The night manager barely glanced at the Jorge Mendez identification as he processed the rental of a modest Honda street bike, accepting cash without questions. With transportation secured, Miguel needed information, and in a city dominated by cartel influence, information was both valuable and dangerous. He headed for a neighborhood known locally as El Corredor, a stretch of mechanics, shops and auto parts dealers that served as the nerve center of Chihuahua's transportation underground. If anyone knew about unusual movements of vehicles or cartel operations affecting truckers, it would be the men who kept the city's fleet running. The shop Miguel sought was unmarked, except for a faded painting of a winged wheel on its rolling metal door. Despite the late hour, light seeped from beneath the door, and the sounds of metal on metal confirmed activity inside. Miguel knocked with the distinctive pattern that identified him as part of the fraternity of professional drivers. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slow ones. After a moment, a small viewing port slid open, and suspicious eyes evaluated him before the door rolled up just enough to allow entry. Inside, the shop was larger than its storefront suggested, extending back into a labyrinth of parts, tools, and vehicles in various states of repair. 3 men were working on an engine block, while a fourth holder, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades under the hood of trucks, supervised from a stool nearby. "We're closed," the older man said without looking up. "I'm looking for Guillermo," Miguel replied. "Salvador from Hermosillo sent me." The reference to Salvador, a legendary mechanic, known throughout northern Mexico for his ability to keep trucks running long past their expected lifespan, caused the older man to study Miguel more carefully. "Salvador's been dead 2 years, he said flatly. "He still owes me for a transmission rebuild on a 98 Kenworth," Miguel countered, completing the verification that identified him as part of the informal network of drivers and mechanics that had developed their own security protocols in response to cartel threats. The older man Guillermo nodded and gestured for his workers to give them privacy. When they were alone, he spoke directly. "You're not local. What's your business?" "One of my drivers was taken at a false checkpoint north of the city. I need to find him." Guillermo's expression hardened. "Cartel business. Nothing I can help with. The cargo is medicine for rural clinics," Miguel pressed. "And the driver is a 25-year-old kid who's getting married in December." Something shifted in Guillermo's eyes, perhaps recognition of the moral weight behind Miguel's quest, or perhaps simply calculation of risk versus potential gain. After a long moment, he nodded toward a back office. "You didn't hear this from me," Guillermo said, once they were behind closed doors, "but there's been talk. Los Sinaloas are preparing something bigger, major shipment north. They've been acquiring vehicles with legitimate paperwork, drivers who know the border crossings, forcing truckers to run drugs," Miguel concluded. "Not just drugs this time," Guillermo corrected. "Word is they're moving high-value, human cargo, political, someone the U.S. authorities would recognize immediately." The implications were staggering. Using legitimate medical supply trucks to smuggle a high-profile figure across the border would provide cover that ordinary cartel vehicles couldn't achieve. The medical convoy's routine border crossings, established paperwork, and regular schedules made them the perfect Trojan horse. Where would they stage something like that? Miguel asked. Guillermo hesitated, the calculation of risk evident in his expression. Finally he pulled a greasy notepad toward him and sketched a quick map. "Warehouse district east of the city, old meatpacking plant. Los Sinaloas use it for ... processing." The euphemism wasn't lost on Miguel. Processing meant many things in cartel operations, none of them humane. "If your driver's alive, that's where they'd take him," Guillermo added. "But listen to me, you go anywhere near that place, you're dead. These aren't street thugs. The compound has security, professional gunmen." Miguel studied the crude map, committing it to memory. "I need one more thing. A way to contact someone in Los Sinaloas, someone with authority." Guillermo stared as if Miguel had lost his mind. "You want to call the cartel directly?" "I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with." After another long hesitation, Guillermo wrote a phone number on the edge of the map. "Intermediary, arranges meetings for cartel business. You don't mention my name, ever." Miguel memorized the number, then watched as Guillermo burned the paper in a small metal trash can, ensuring no evidence remained of their exchange. As Miguel prepared to leave, Guillermo caught his arm. "Whatever you're planning, there are other ways. People who can help federals who aren't bought. My driver doesn't have time for me to figure out who's corrupt and who isn't," Miguel replied simply. Outside again, Miguel checked his satellite phone. No messages from his team, a good sign that they were maintaining protocol and keeping their heads down. He sent a brief text to Pedro's burner phone, still operational, maintained positions, 24-hour window. Next, Miguel called the intermediary number Guillermo had provided. When a man answered, Miguel spoke with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. I need to speak with whoever is in charge of the checkpoint operation north of the city. I have information about the convoy they're looking for. There was a long pause before the man responded. Information is worthless unless verified. The convoy was carrying medical supplies for rural clinics, Miguel stated. 6 trucks. Transportes Médicos del Norte driver you have is Ernesto Vargas. His twin brother Eduardo is still out there. You are not after the cargo, you want the trucks and drivers for a special shipment. Another pause, longer this time. Where are you? Somewhere safe, Miguel replied. I'm willing to meet, but only with someone who can make decisions. The call ended abruptly, leaving Miguel uncertain whether his gambit would pay off, or if he had just painted an even larger target on his back. Either way, there was no turning back now. Miguel drove the rental motorcycle to a location, several blocks from the warehouse Guillermo had identified, parking it where it would be easily accessible. For a quick escape, on foot again, he circled the compound carefully, identifying security positions, entrance points, and possible weaknesses. The old meatpacking plant was an ideal cartel facility, isolated within an industrial zone that emptied at night, surrounded by a high wall topped with razor wire, with clear sightlines that made approaching undetected nearly impossible. Miguel counted at least 6 armed guards patrolling the perimeter, with more likely inside. The main gate was secured by a checkpoint with 2 men carrying automatic weapons. Most significantly, Miguel spotted 5 trucks parked in the loading area, not his team's vehicles, but similar models, all with their identifying markings removed or painted over. The cartel wasn't just after his convoy, they were assembling a fleet. As Miguel considered his options, each seemingly more impossible than the last, his satellite phone vibrated. The message was from an unknown number, containing only an address and a time. 1 hour from now, someone with authority had decided to meet. The location was a restaurant called El Toro Rojo on the outskirts of the city, the kind of upscale establishment that catered to wealthy businessmen and politicians, where privacy was guaranteed and questions were never asked. Miguel approached carefully, aware that this could easily be a trap. He entered through the kitchen, slipping past staff too busy to challenge his presence, and made his way to the private dining rooms at the back. A man in an expensive suit stood outside one of the rooms, his bearing and the subtle bulge beneath his jacket identifying him as security rather than staff. Jorge Mendez, Miguel said, using his false identity. The guard patted him down thoroughly, removing his satellite phone before allowing him to enter the private room. Inside, a single man sat at a large table set for a late dinner. He was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and the carefully maintained physique of someone for whom appearance was a form of power. He wore no obvious symbols of wealth, except for a single gold ring and a watch that probably cost more than Miguel earned in a year. Sit, the man said, gesturing to the chair across from him. You should try the carne asada. It's excellent here. Miguel remained standing. I didn't come for dinner. No, you came about your driver. The man took a sip of red wine, studying Miguel over the rim of his glass. Or should I say, your drivers, Miguel Reyes. The use of his real name sent a chill through Miguel, but he kept his expression neutral. So you know who I am, of course. Just as I know your convoy has scattered like cockroaches when the light comes on. Very resourceful. Most would have surrendered. When they saw our roadblocks, the man set down his glass and smiled thinly. I am Alejandro Vega. Perhaps you've heard of me. Miguel had indeed heard the name, a high-ranking lieutenant in the Sinaloa cartel, known for both his business acumen and his ruthlessness. That someone of Vega's stature was personally involved confirmed the importance of whatever operation was underway. Where is Ernesto Vargas? Miguel asked directly. Alive, cooperative, after some persuasion. Vega gestured to the chair again. Please, sit. Standing throughout our conversation would be ... exhausting. Miguel sat, keeping his hands visible on the table. What do you want with my convoy? Direct. Good. Vega seemed to approve of Miguel's approach. What I want is simple. Your company has established routes across the border, regular schedules, proper paperwork. Your drivers know the crossings, the procedures, the officials. You are, in essence, invisible trucks that no one looks at too carefully because they've seen them 100 times before. You want us to smuggle drugs, Miguel stated. Vega laughed softly. If I wanted to move product, I have 1,000 ways to do it. No, what I need is your legitimacy for a single, special shipment. A passenger, let's say. Someone whose crossing needs to be uneventful. And if we refuse, then the alternative becomes unpleasant. Vega's smile never wavered. Your driver, Ernesto, already understands this. Soon, you all will. Or perhaps, not all perhaps, we only need 2 or 3 of you. The rest would become ... unnecessary. Miguel absorbed this, understanding the full dimensions of the threat. Vega was offering a devil's bargain: cooperation in exchange for survival. Refusal meant death, not just for Miguel but for his entire team. I need proof that Ernesto is alive, Miguel said. Vega nodded to his guard, who stepped outside briefly. Before returning with the phone, he placed it on the table and played a video showing Ernesto, face bruised but very much alive, sitting in what appeared to be a storage room, speaking today's date and confirming his identity. Satisfied, Vega asked, retrieving the phone. Now, here is my offer. You will contact your scattered drivers and bring them in. You will prepare your trucks for a special modification, a compartment suitable for transporting a passenger across the border without detection. In 3 days, you will make the crossing as usual, delivering your medical supplies and our passenger. After that, you all go free, considerably wealthier, and we never need to interact again. And if I agree, how do I know you'll keep your word? Vega spread his hands in a gesture of openness. Because it is good business. Dead truckers draw attention. Investigations, complications. Live truckers who return to their normal routes, who maintain the appearance of legitimacy that makes them valuable in the first place. That is much more useful to me. Miguel appeared to consider the offer, his expression giving nothing away. In reality, his mind was racing through implications and possibilities, seeking leverage in a situation where he seemingly had none. I'll need to speak to my drivers directly, Miguel finally said. They trust me, but they'll need reassurance, of course. You'll have supervised communication. Vega leaned forward slightly. Do we have an agreement? Senor Reyes. Miguel met his gaze steadily. I need 24 hours to contact everyone, make arrangements. You have 12. Vega stood, signaling the end of the meeting. My associate will contact you with a location for your team to gather. I suggest you be persuasive when speaking with them. Yours depend on your powers of persuasion. As Miguel was escorted out through a back entrance, his satellite phone was returned to him. The screen showed 3 missed messages, all from Pedro, growing increasingly urgent. The first, Carlos missing. Attempted delivery. No contact 3 hours. The second, Eduardo tracked Ernesto's phone. Signal active at industrial zone. And finally, Javier spotted cartel vehicles at hospital. Moving to secondary location. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Now 2 drivers were missing, and the cartel was closing in on the others. Miguel had 12 hours to formulate a plan that would rescue his captured teammates, protect those still free, and somehow neutralize a cartel operation backed by seemingly unlimited resources. That as he retrieved his motorcycle and headed for a safe house, a small motel on the city's south side, where he had paid cash for a room under his false identity. Miguel's mind worked through the pieces of the puzzle Vega had inadvertently provided. The cartel needed the convoy's legitimacy for their border crossing. That meant they couldn't simply hijack the trucks and force random drivers to make the crossing. The border authorities knew the regular drivers by sight. It had to be Miguel's team, willingly cooperating, maintaining the appearance of a routine medical delivery. That requirement gave Miguel his first piece of leverage. The second came from Eduardo's message about tracking Ernesto's phone. If the cartel was keeping the phone active, perhaps to monitor any communications, it created a vulnerability, a way to pinpoint exactly where, within the compound, Ernesto was being held. By the time Miguel reached the motel, the outlines of a counter-strategy had begun to form in his mind. It was audacious to the point of insanity, dependent on precise timing and coordination between team members who were scattered and under surveillance. It would require technological skills Miguel didn't possess, contacts he didn't have, and a level of deception that went against his nature as a straightforward man. But it was the only chance they had. Working through the night, Miguel used his satellite phone to make a series of carefully worded calls, first to Pedro, establishing a secure method of communication through coded text messages that would appear innocent if intercepted. Then to Eduardo, providing specific instructions for tracking and data collection. Finally, to Javier, the youngest but also the most technologically savvy of his drivers. With detailed technical requirements dot by dawn, Miguel had put in motion a complex sequence of events designed to appear as surrender while actually laying the groundwork for a devastating counterstrike. He had told each driver only what they absolutely needed to know, compartmentalizing the plan to ensure that if any one of them was captured, the entire strategy wouldn't be compromised. As the city awakened around him, Miguel finally allowed himself a few hours of restless sleep. He would need every ounce of energy and clarity for what was to come. When he awoke mid-morning, a new message waited on his phone: a location and time for the convoy to reassemble under cartel supervision. The meeting point was an abandoned airstrip 20 kilometers outside the city, isolated enough to prevent any possibility of intervention by authorities. Miguel sent confirmation, then set about the final preparations. He visited 3 separate hardware stores, purchasing different components at each to avoid suspicion. He made contact with Guillermo at the mechanic's shop again, this time requesting specific equipment that would be waiting for him at a designated drop-off point. And he made one final call to a number he had hoped never to use, reaching out to a contact from his military service days who now worked in an entirely different capacity. By late afternoon, Miguel was back on his motorcycle, heading for the rendezvous point ahead of the designated time. He needed to scout the location thoroughly before his team arrived. Understanding that the cartel would have prepared the ground to their advantage, the abandoned airstrip was exactly as Miguel had expected: a flat, exposed area with a crumbling concrete runway surrounded by scrubland that provided little cover. An old control tower stood at one end, giving a commanding view of the entire area. Anyone approaching would be visible for kilometers, but Miguel observed from a distant ridge as cartel vehicles began arriving first, security teams establishing a perimeter, then more specialized personnel setting up equipment in a cluster of derelict hangars. Finally, a convoy of 3 black SUVs arrived, one of which Miguel recognized from the warehouse compound. Through binoculars, he watched as Ernesto was removed from one vehicle and Carlos from another, both men showing signs of rough handling but moving under their own power. They were taken into one of the hangars, disappearing from view. That at precisely the appointed time, Miguel descended from his observation point and approached the airstrip openly, riding his motorcycle directly toward the main hangar where Vega would be waiting. As expected, he was intercepted by armed guards who escorted him the rest of the way, the muzzles of their weapons never wavering from his back. Inside the hangar, Miguel found a scene that might have been comic if it weren't so deadly serious. Vega had established a kind of mobile command center, complete with communications equipment, digital displays, and the trappings of authority. He sat behind a makeshift desk, looking for all the world like an executive receiving a subordinate. Reyes, Vega greeted him, right on time. I appreciate punctuality in business associates. Where are my drivers? Miguel asked. Vega gestured, and Ernesto and Carlos were brought forward from a side room. Both men showed signs of having been beaten, Carlos more severely, his left eye swollen shut and dried blood caking his silver mustache. They stared at Miguel with a mixture of relief and apprehension. I've done as you asked, Miguel said to Vega. My team will be arriving within the hour. All of them, Vega pressed. All who matter for your operation, Miguel replied evenly. 5 experienced drivers who know the border crossings. The 6th was just a trainee. He panicked and ran when the shooting started, probably halfway to Guatemala by now. Vega studied Miguel's face, searching for deception. Finding none that satisfied him, he nodded. Very good. Once they arrive, we'll discuss the specifics of our arrangement. I want to speak with my men, Miguel insisted. Alone. You misunderstand your position, Senor Reyes. You don't make demands here. It's not a demand. It's a practical necessity. Miguel held Vega's gaze. These men need to hear directly from me that cooperation is their only option. Otherwise, you'll be dealing with resistance at every step. Inefficient, bad business. Vega considered this, then inclined his head slightly. 5 minutes. Under guard. Miguel was allowed to move to a corner of the hangar with Ernesto and Carlos. a guard standing just out of earshot, but watching closely. "Are you all right?" Miguel asked, quietly, genuine concern in his voice. "We'll live," Carlos replied, his voice raspy. "For now." "Listen carefully," Miguel said, his tone shifting to urgent intensity. "Things are going to happen very fast. When they do, drop to the ground and stay there until I give the out clear. No matter what you see or hear, don't move." Confusion showed on their faces, but both men nodded slightly, trusting Miguel despite the apparent hopelessness of their situation. "What's the plan?" Ernesto whispered. "The less you know, the safer you are," Miguel replied. "Just be ready." Their brief conference was interrupted by the arrival of vehicles outside, the distinctive sound of truck engines, rather than cars. Pedro, Eduardo and Javier had arrived with their vehicles as instructed. As they were led into the hangar, Miguel caught each man's eye in turn, receiving almost imperceptible nods that confirmed everything was in place. Vega, watching the interaction closely, appeared satisfied by what he saw. Defeated team leader preparing his men to accept an unpleasant reality. "Now that we're all here," Vega announced, "let me explain exactly what will happen next." But before he could continue, the hangar was plunged into darkness as every light simultaneously failed. In the moment of confusion that followed, Miguel moved with practiced precision, pulling Carlos and Ernesto to the floor as he had instructed. What happened next would later be described in whispered rumors throughout northern Mexico, an operation so precisely executed and devastatingly effective that it became cartel legend, a cautionary tale of underestimating one's opponent. The convoy of medical supply truckers, it seemed, had not come to surrender after all. 3 weeks later, Miguel Reyes sat on the small patio of his Hermosillo home, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson. A cup of his wife Elena's coffee cooled beside him, untouched. His hands, which had always been steady on the wheel of his truck, trembled slightly as he raised a cigarette to his lips, a habit he had abandoned years ago, but recently resumed. The sounds of normality filtered through the open windows behind him. Elena, preparing dinner. Lucia, on the phone with a classmate discussing medical school assignments. Ordinary moments that now seemed extraordinary in their simple continuity. Miguel's gaze drifted to the newspaper on the table beside him. The headlines had been dominated for days by the same story: a major operation against the Sinaloa cartel that had resulted in the arrest of several high-ranking lieutenants, including the notorious Alejandro Vega. Details remained classified, but sources indicated the operation had been initiated based on intelligence from an unexpected source. Evidence so comprehensive and damning that the federal authorities had no choice but to act, despite the cartel's deep influence. What the newspapers couldn't report, was how that evidence had come to light, how a convoy of medical supply truckers had executed one of the most audacious counterintelligence operations in the history of Mexico's drug war. The darkness in the hangar that night had lasted only seconds before emergency generators kicked in, but those seconds had been enough. Javier, the tech-savvy young driver, had spent his hours in hiding, installing signal jammers in his truck that, when activated, disrupted all communications within a half-kilometer radius, cutting off Vega's team from any possibility of calling for reinforcements. Simultaneously, Pedro, drawing on his military training, had deployed a series of diversionary devices around the perimeter of the airstrip. Not explosives, but an intricate arrangement of speakers broadcasting recorded gunfire and engines, creating the impression of a large-scale assault from multiple directions. The resulting confusion had sent Vega's security forces scrambling outward to defend against a phantom attack, leaving the command center vulnerable. In that critical window, Eduardo had activated the final component of Miguel's planner, direct data link to the very individual Miguel had contacted during his preparations, a federal prosecutor who had been building a case against Vega for years, but lacked the evidence to move against someone so protected. What Vega never realized was that every word spoken in that hangar, every detail of the operation he had planned, every piece of communication sent or received through his equipment, was being transmitted in real time to federal authorities. The emergency generators that restored power had been compromised in advance by Guillermo's mechanics, modified to create a power surge that disabled the cartel's security protocols while appearing to function normally. By the time Vega understood what was happening, federales were already moving in, not the corrupted local police. but a specialized unit from Mexico City, operating on direct presidential authority, with no advance notice to local officials who might have tipped off the cartel. Miguel closed his eyes, remembering the moment when the hangar doors had burst open and the federal agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. The look of utter disbelief on Vega's face as he realized he had been outmaneuvered, not by a rival cartel or sophisticated intelligence agency, but by a group of truckers protecting their own. The aftermath had been a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and protective custody as the full extent of the cartel operation was uncovered. The special passenger Vega had planned to transport across the border turned out to be a witness to high-level corruption within both Mexican and American governments, someone whose testimony could implicate officials at the highest levels, explaining the extraordinary measures taken to ensure their crossing went undetected. A soft touch on his shoulder brought Miguel back to the present. Alina stood beside him, concern evident in her eyes. "You're thinking about it again," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Miguel nodded, covering her hand with his own. "Hard not to." "The company called again today," Alina said. "They want to know when you're coming back." Transportes Medicos del Norte had been effusive in their gratitude and support after the incident. The company had placed all 6 drivers on paid leave, arranged for counseling services, and publicly committed to enhanced security measures for future deliveries. The CEO had personally visited each driver's family, assuring them that their jobs were secure for as long as they wished to return. "I don't know if I am," Miguel admitted, voicing aloud the thought that had been growing in his mind for weeks. Alina sat beside him, saying nothing, allowing him the space to continue at his own pace. 23 years on the road, Miguel finally said. "Always thought I'd retire after 30, maybe 35, but now, ... He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the complex emotions that had reshaped his relationship with his profession. "No one would blame you," Alina said softly. "After what happened, what could have happened? It's not fear," Miguel interrupted, needing her to understand. "Not exactly. And it wasn't, though fear certainly played a part." What Miguel struggled to explain was how fundamentally the experience had changed him. The Miguel Reyes who had driven out of Hermosillo that morning 3 weeks ago had been a man who believed in systems, in protocols, in the essential order of things. He had trusted that roads led where maps said they would, that authorities protected those who followed the rules, that his role in the world was clearly defined and understood, that Miguel Reyes no longer existed. "I need to tell you something," he said, turning to face his wife directly. "Something I haven't told anyone else." Over the next hour, as the sunset deepened into twilight and finally gave way to a star-filled desert night, Miguel shared the full story of what had happened at the abandoned airstrip. Not the sanitized version he had given to authorities or the reassuring outline he had provided to his family, but the raw truth of the choices he had made and the lines he had crossed. How he had used his military contact not just to relay evidence, but to ensure the raid would be timed precisely when he signaled readiness, making him, in effect, the operation controller rather than merely an informant. How he had authorized Pedro to place charges at strategic points around the airstrip, not just diversionary devices as reported, but actual explosives that could have been detonated if the federal raid had failed, creating an escape opportunity but potentially causing casualties.